Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8. And what week 8 means actually is that we are exactly halfway done with the semester. So we are making great progress. This week, I want to talk about the progressive era and relate to some of the readings that I've assigned you. And I also want to talk about what's right there on that slide, the progressive era, its antecedents and implications. And one of the implications, as a matter of fact, has to do with budgets, the way we do budgets at the national government level. Um, and that chapter in the Kettle text connects to the progressive era because of that very topic, which is budgets. Now, that's a topic you're going to hear a lot more of when you take the public budgeting class. However, right here, I think it's really important to introduce this so that you understand that the progressive era really, in terms of public administration, is very far reaching, reaching into a lot of different areas, a lot of different aspects of public administration. So let's get right into that. Okay, so I like Ken Burns films. Um, I just spent a few nights watching Ken Burns' Vietnam series. I couldn't watch it live, but I spent a lot of late evenings catching up with the various videos. I'd encourage you to watch that. As it turns out, Vietnam, believe it or not, the Vietnam War, at least the American involvement in it, and the French involvement in Vietnam has antecedents that, of course, go back to the colonial era and go to the progressive era as well. But, what is the progressive era? I like to think of it in terms of these Ken Burns films. So, arguably one of Ken Burns' most famous series, the one that really put him on the map as a historian that produces these well documented and very well done documentaries, is the Civil War. And the Civil War, really, we know, was a tragic, bloody, very divisive era in American history, but it was really a watershed, and it really straddles America's past and its future. And in a sense, which I'll talk about in a moment, the Civil War itself was a completion of the constitutional era. And then Ken did a series called The West. And when we think of westward expansion, um, settlement, the the railroad, and homesteading, which have really strong connections in Nebraska, and accompanied by the final defeat of, or the genocide of, depending on your perspective, of Native Americans, which essentially ended at Wounded Knee in 1890. Um, the West really was something that was an antecedent of the Progressive era, along with the Civil War. And then uh, Burns did a series on Prohibition, and we all think we're fairly familiar with Prohibition, and we are, as a failed social experiment. Um, it was that. It was a religiously inspired movement to cleanse the nation of an actual alcoholism epidemic. You know, people talk about prohibition as this, they do talk about the religious aspects. What they don't often mention is that America had a genuine alcohol problem in the 1800s that was widespread. Um, but but beyond that, prohibition itself is connected to some progressive era ideas such as women's suffrage and women's rights. And that is that's a very interesting aspect that also doesn't get talked about much. Um, then there was a really good series by Burns on the national parks. The national parks are actually directly connected to the progressive era. The national parks were the brainchild of President Theodore Roosevelt. Um, the national park system probably would not have existed without the foresight of Roosevelt. And it was a really progressive idea at the time, to take lands and set them aside forever from development and settlement. And it really was one of the hallmarks of the progressive era. And then baseball, which you wouldn't think, but one of the things about baseball, especially in the early 1900s, was that it was a sport that a pastime that united classes. It's true enough that at Major League Baseball games during that period, whites and blacks didn't sit together, but they all went to baseball games. Um, and it's interesting how Burns treats baseball as this uniting pastime. And then Burns did a series called The Roosevelts, which I'm not sure was as greatly received as some of his series, but it really connects the strident and what Roosevelt himself called the manly progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt to the patrician kind of reformer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his distant cousin. And then finally, there's this series that Burns did called Jazz, which is really interesting because jazz music is uniquely American, and it primarily came to the mainstream of American culture again through black musicians. But jazz itself was discovered by the white majority um, in the 1920s in speakeasies and places like that that wouldn't have existed without without the influence of prohibition. So without the idea that people were going to illegal bars to drink and be entertained by jazz musicians, um, jazz may not have actually been this kind of cross-racial entertainment that it became. So that's how I like to think of the progressive era. But let me get into more specific detail. So I said there were some antecedents of the progressive era, and I point to the Civil War. And as I'm talking, look at this chart right here. Um, the point of the Civil War, in a sense, is that you start out by considering that the Civil War was the most bloody war in American history. Um, the service rate for the Civil War and World War II were about the same. That is, the rate of citizens per 100,000 per 1,000 serving in the war. So that's pretty high. Um, about 11% of the whole population. The whole population. Uh, but the whole population, for the most part, wasn't serving. It was mostly men, certainly. Though several women did serve, and several women lost their lives in the Civil War. Um, but in terms of deaths, um, the total deaths in the Civil War were nearly 500,000, uh, and that was huge. The death rate was 140, 140 per 1,000 population. Think about that. That is a huge number compared to uh, World War II, where it was about 18 to 1,000. The very high number in the Mexican War is interesting because there weren't actually that many soldiers involved in the Mexican War. Most of those soldiers in the Mexican War died of disease. As a matter of fact, a lot died of malaria. But in terms of just of combat loss, the Civil War was certainly the bloodiest war in American history, far bloodier even than World War II and Vietnam. Um, and the wounded rate was much higher than any other war, with some horrific wounds and injuries that occurred during the Civil War. So I'm talking about all this, and you're saying, okay, what's that have to do with the progressive era? Which I'll get to in a second. So the Civil War itself, philosophically, if we want to think of it that way, was really a completion of the founding era. So we've talked about the Constitution a lot. We read that article by Stivers where she talked about uh, the great moral oversight of the founders of the founding generation. And she's quite right. It was a moral oversight to compromise on the issue of slavery. Now, I don't know what would have happened had they not, but in fact, I agree with Stivers that it was a great moral oversight. But there was always this question in America whether states could secede from the Union. Um, a lot of people still talk about this, but really the Civil War settled that. And Lincoln himself, said that The war was about keeping the Union together. Um, but the tension, the constitutional tension that had existed since 1787 in the United States really was over the legality and the spread of slavery. And and so that was never ever very far below the surface in political discussions. It really immediately after the constitutional era right up to the Civil War. The discussion became more belligerent and more unbearable, but it was never far below the surface. Many of the compromises that occurred after the founding era were as a result of slavery. The Missouri Compromise, if you've heard of that, and I know you have, but that was in 1820. It's called the Missouri Compromise because it was the compromise that Congress implemented to let the state of Missouri in the Union. Missouri was admitted as a slave state. The state of Maine was admitted as a non-slave state, as a free state. Thereafter, the compromise was that for every state that was admitted as a slave state, a state had to be admitted as a free state. So the number of states would stay equal. Well, that was kind of blown up by what we call the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which implemented this doctrine that Stephen Douglas championed called popular sovereignty, which sounds like a great thing. What Douglas was talking about, though, was the idea that when states were admitted to the Union, the populace could decide if they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. And so the pre-Civil War to the Civil War itself actually occurred in the state of Kansas and bled over into Missouri as Kansas was trying to be admitted to the Union. There was actually a civil war within Kansas between free staters and slave staters. So Kansas eventually was admitted as a free state, but not without a lot of bloodshed. And so slavery was always right there, right at the surface. But the Civil War really, it did end slavery. It didn't bring about civil rights for former slaves or their descendants really right away. It probably could have, but it did not, because these amendments, these three amendments that I have on here, really weren't fully implemented. You know, the 13th Amendment did end slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. Although post 13th Amendment, sharecropping practices in the South were really only a slight improvement, where black farmers really had to pay in kind for the land they rented to the owner of the land. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves, and it extended the due process clause, which already existed in the Fifth Amendment. It extended due process to the states. So what the 14th Amendment did, which was really important, was it said that the due process clause, that no one could be denied due process of law, denied their rights without due process of law, extended from the federal government, the national government, to state governments. Now, Native Americans were not recognized as persons until the Standing Bear case of 1898, which occurred right in Omaha. The 15th Amendment then granted former slaves the right to vote. Although, and this famously happened, post-Reconstruction, Southern states found ways to skirt this amendment and deny the vote to black people. That had to be corrected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So really, the Civil War itself is this antecedent of a more progressive America. It's the beginning stages of it. Now, what's interesting about the Civil War, I talked about all the bloodshed, and the reason I did that was to lead to this. There was a pension system for Civil War veterans, of course, Union veterans. About 37% post-Civil War of the white males in the North between 15 and 44 years old had served. Almost 40% of that population had served in the Civil War. And Lincoln famously said in his second inaugural address that it was the responsibility of the nation to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and for his orphan. Excuse me. Um, the Civil War pension system was called by researcher Scotchbowl. She called it America's first Social Security system. That is because the reason she called it that, because at a certain point in time, most of the aged men, anyway, in the United States were getting Civil War pensions for life. Um, and it really became a form of Social Security because it actually applied to those men's widows as well. It actually helped generate and sustain a very early interest group, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was theoretically a fraternal order of Northern veterans. But really, they were a lobbying organization that lobbied for better improvements to the Civil War pension system, and there were several, and they influenced the distribution of government benefits. Orloff and Goodnow talk about the rise of patronage politics through political parties. Well, a lot of that actually had to do with Civil War pensions because, as it turns out, the Republican Party in the North was very much interested in continually improving the Civil War pension system, which got them votes, um, and keeping their officials involved in the Civil War pension system. And importantly, it was a use for what the government had in terms of surplus government revenues. We often don't get surpluses, but there was a steady surplus in the budget for about 50 years, believe it or not. Most of that income came from tariffs and taxes on alcohol distribution. But about 28 to 33% of all federal revenue went to the Civil War pension system. So imagine that. About 28 to 33% of all federal revenue paid for the Civil War pension system. That is more than the percentage that goes for Social Security now. And it led to other innovations. The idea that retirement should be something that is funded. The first federal workers' retirement system was actually introduced in 1920. Social Security, as we know, was introduced in 1935. Before Social Security was introduced, many private companies, many school districts had innovated pensions themselves. And so really the Civil War pension system led to a larger belief that pensions were a necessity for working adults. And so during the Civil War itself, there were a number of landmark laws that were passed that actually have a lot to do with the Progressive era in the future. One is the Homestead Act, passed in 1862, while the Civil War was blazing. Um, Along with the Homestead Act, the United States Department of Agriculture was created in 1862. So what was that all about? And why was that progressive? What the Homestead Act did was it granted 160 acres of farmland to families who just agreed to start farming that land within 5 years. And many of them did. Many of them didn't, but many of them did. Many of you have ancestors who are homesteaders. A lot of Americans do. I do. It it is something that is just ingrained in the settlement of the West, especially, and a lot of people don't even think about it. But um, the Department of Agriculture, why was it founded? It was founded actually as a department whose mission was to promote an industry. Now, many people say that government shouldn't be involved in the economy. I will tell you that the Department of Agriculture was specifically founded to be involved in the economy, especially the farm economy. It was designed to promote the practice of agriculture. Why? Because life on that 160 acres was very difficult. The Department of Agriculture was set up to aid those farmers and make sure that they could sustain their farming practice into the future. Um, of course, the USDA has branched off into other areas, but that is why the USDA was founded. The Land Grant Act of 1862, also called the Morrill Act, if you go to the campus on Lincoln, there's a Morrill Hall. It's named for the Morrill Act. What that did was it granted each state 30,000 acres of land for each congressional seat it had, and it created this entity we call land grant universities. The University of Nebraska in Lincoln, the original University of Nebraska, was a land grant university. These land grant universities uh, were to specialize in scholarship in the education, uh, uh, scholarship and education in the art and science of agriculture. Land grant colleges also established Reserve Officer Training Corps, or what we call ROTC these days. Um, why was that established? It was established so that the Army could have enough officers to serve in war if needed. Um, in 1890, the Land Grant Act was actually effectively amended, and it established what we now call historic black colleges and universities. So universities like Grambling State, were established under this 1890 Act. It was a so the Land Grant Act was actually a very influential and important act in terms of education in the United States. Further antecedents of the Progressive Era. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, same year as the USDA and the Homestead Act, Lincoln signed to actually build the Transcontinental Railroad. It's sometimes called the Transcontinental Railroad Act, but really what it did was it said, we're going to build a railroad from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. And we did that. How did we do that? It was a vast public-private partnership. The Union Pacific Railroad, which became a very profitable corporation, did not exist before the establishment of the Pacific Railway Act. It stood up to build from the eastern terminus to the west, and the Central Pacific Railroad, which had existed, built from the western terminus in Sacramento, and they met in Utah. Well, both railroads benefited from their debt being guaranteed by the federal government. Both railroads were granted large tracts of land, some of which they sold, a lot of which they sold, a lot of which they kept later for mining and other rights. The coal in Wyoming was the property of the Union Pacific Railroad, which actually helped it become very wealthy later on. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, getting closer to what we traditionally call the Progressive Era, was created then to regulate these railroads, because even though the government essentially promoted the railroads became very powerful and were competing with another industry that was being promoted by the federal government, namely farmers. Farmers complained in mass about the freight rates that were being charged by the railroads to ship their produce. So in stepped the federal government to stand up the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was initially established to regulate rates on railroads, and to help limit the monopolistic tendencies of railroads. The Civil Service Reform Act, or the Pendleton Act of 1883, might sound familiar because it was in the wake of this that Wilson wrote his famous article. The Pendleton Act really was written to try to reform the effect of the spoils system in hiring at the federal level. So these were all really acts that were leading up to a very much more involved government to economy effort later on. And so I list all these things to really discuss this idea that it wasn't just in the New Deal era in the 1930s that government became involved in the economy. Government had been involved in the economy for a number of decades right after, and including the Civil War era. Perhaps not to the extent that government was later involved, but really government was involved in the economy. So what was happening socially during this antecedent era to the Progressive Era? Well, for one thing, from really around the Civil War era forward, there was a mass migration into the United States, a huge immigration into the United States. And so the stories of Ellis Island all have to do with this boom in immigration. And so the red line on this chart shows the percentage of the population, and on the left-hand side you see the percentages. The percentage of population that was foreign born, according to census numbers. So every 10 years when the census is conducted, this indicates the percentage of population foreign born. So you can see on the top table that by 1890, almost 15% of the population was foreign born. And that number was really fairly consistent. That was the high water mark. But from about 1860 to about 1920, a very large percentage of the population was foreign born. And so the number of foreign born citizens was steadily increasing right up to 1920 when the immigration laws were changed, and then decreased to about 1970 when the immigration laws were changed again. And you can see what happened in 1970, that the percentage of foreign born citizens actually increased again. And this is what we see today. But it was this pre-progressive era time when a, a large number of immigrants were coming to the United States. So, okay, so what's the big deal about that? The big deal is that this was a social issue because, of course, as you might imagine, not everyone welcomed uh, the immigrants. There was a party called the Know Nothing Party. That was really not their official name. They were called the American Party. But from about 1849 to 1856, they broke up, and many of them actually became part of the Republican Party. But their main platform was opposition to immigration, particularly, interestingly enough, Catholics and Germans. So it was really a lot of white Protestants who opposed Catholicism in the United States. Well, as it turns out, many of the Southern Germans at the time were Catholics. Um, though that will come into play later on as we talk about Prohibition. The Mormon migration of about 1844 to 1868 from New York to Illinois to Missouri to Utah actually occurred because of persecution, because, again, the white Protestant population really didn't like the doctrine of the Mormons, particularly their official stance on polygamy. There was an act called the Chinese Exclusion Act, a very kind of shameful act, really. Um, it was passed in 1882 after the railroad was built, by the way, that purposely excluded immigrants from China. Period. No immigrants from China. That was repealed in 1942. There was a so-called gentleman's agreement um, between the United States and Japan in 1907 that limited Japanese immigration to the United States. It was often ignored, but it was there. There was a mass migration of African Americans from the South after 1910 or so. Um, and so that first migration was about 1910 to 1930, and the second migration was the World War II and post-World War II era. There was this so-called Grapes of Wrath migration, which occurred during the Depression and the simultaneous Dust Bowl. The two things really weren't related, but they happened at the same time. And if you've read the book Grapes of Wrath or seen the movie, the old movie with Henry Fonda, that was about a great migration from the Midwest to California. And California's population doubled really between 1930 and 1950. Um, the Immigration Act of 1924, which I referred to earlier, it did establish this thing, the quota system. So it established this quota based on 2% of that nationality in the 1890 census. And so basically that act completely excluded Asian immigration into the United States. By 1965, we established the whole national origin quota system. So this was sort of the social backdrop of what was going on in the immediate years prior to the Progressive era. And here's really one last issue that comes into play when you read what Cam Stivers has to say about bureau men and settlement women. The settlement movement, we read about Jane Addams and the Hull House in Chicago. There were others. The settlement movement really was there to provide service to an immigrant population that lived in cities in some fairly squalid conditions. But what happened socially in the United States was we shifted from an agrarian populace to an urban populace. Of course, there are still people living on farms. There are still farmers. But the ideal of this Jeffersonian yeoman farmer really, really kind of went out the window, even though we still have a great affinity for that. We still have a great affinity for the homestead era. Um, but in fact, by 1920, most Americans lived in cities, and the cities were booming between about 1880 and 1920. They were exploding to the point where they really couldn't handle the the number of people moving into cities. So when we talk about the progressive era, what are we talking about? This era from, let's say, 1890 to about 1920. Well, really, the thing is, the progressive era is not one thing. Now, one of the interesting things about the progressive era was we saw the most constitutional amendments passed uh, from 1910 to about 1920 in one period since the Bill of Rights was passed, um, immediately after the Constitution. So these four amendments, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, were passed during this period, and they all actually have something to do with each other, though we don't often talk about it. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and it established income tax. Well, it was a direct tax, which was in violation of the Constitution. That's why it required an amendment. But what a lot of people don't realize is that actually coming up with a new tax was a progressive move, and I'll get to why that was in just a second. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, had to do with the direct election of senators. That is, senators were no longer selected by state legislatures, they were elected by the people. And that was a progressive amendment. The 18th Amendment was prohibition, which outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation into, or the exportation of the United States, right? So alcohol, it wasn't illegal to drink, by the way, during Prohibition. Specifically was not illegal to drink. It was illegal to sell alcohol and to buy alcohol. Um, Routinely violated, but it was thought to be a progressive amendment. And the 19th Amendment actually established the right of women to vote nationally. So all these things were actually progressive. So as it turns out, many of the women involved in the Prohibition movement who had been involved in the temperance movement for decades, really, um, were also suffragettes, as they were called. They were the same women calling for prohibition who were calling for the right of women to vote. What was the rationale? The rationale actually originally was, if I could vote as a woman, I would vote to make alcohol sale illegal. I know for sure that my husband, who is a drunk, wouldn't vote for that, but if I could vote, I would do that. That's kind of the connection in a dumbed down way, in my own dumbed down way, but that is the connection. Um, why is the establishment of an income tax progressive? As it turns out, some of the same people who supported prohibition supported the establishment of an income tax. Why? Because most of the revenue at the federal government level came from tariffs and taxes on the sale of alcohol. So the reasoning was, if another tax base can be established, the federal government won't need uh, the revenue from liquor taxes. And in fact, that's really what happened. Um, the income tax effectively and eventually replaced that source of revenue. There is still excise taxes on alcohol, as you know. Not nearly as much as income tax. Income tax now is the single largest single source of revenue for the United States. There are many other sources, but it's the largest single one. Why was the direct election of senators a progressive movement? Actually, this is interesting because this spoke to the idea that the people are sovereign, that the states themselves are not necessarily. Um, when you think about the Electoral College, in a sense, my view has always been that if the United States was going to pass an amendment to do away with the Electoral College, this would have been the time to do it. Because the 17th Amendment really says that what the Constitution says about senators representing the states and the House of Representatives representing the people, that was overturned. So senators and the House both represent the people. So if that is the case, then why do we have the Electoral College that actually represents the states in a sense? So my view is if somebody was going to do away with the Electoral College, this would have been the time to do that. So continuing on this theme that the progressive era is not one thing. When we think about the progressive era, we're partially focused on individuals like President Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson at the national level. Um, we think about things like the Spanish-American War, which was another side of Theodore Roosevelt. So even though the same president who was very progressive in areas like the national park system um, and uh, rights of women, he actually was also very imperialist minded. Of course, the Panama Canal famously was pushed by President Roosevelt. But uh, the Spanish-American War in 1898 ended up with the United States annexing Cuba, uh, which was later liberated by the United States, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, um, and those are all American territories. Still, Puerto Rico and Guam are American territories. Um, the first national park, of course, we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is again thought to be of kind of a progressive thing by many people because it limits the power of corporations. Um, the United States entered the Great War in 1917, and that was under President Wilson. Um, Wars aren't progressive necessarily, but the ideals that Wilson espoused were very progressive. Wilson said that World War I, known as the Great War at the time, was a war to end all wars. He said it was a war to save democracy. Um, the League of Nations, which Wilson proposed, and ironically, the United States never became part of because the Senate refused to ratify the treaty, um, was a progressive thing. Wilson truly believed that the League of Nations was going to end war among nations, that conflicts could be discussed and not fought over. And so all this progressivism, Warren Harding was elected in 1920 with his campaign promise of a return to normalcy. Now that, when you think of a campaign promise, that doesn't sound like much, but the country probably was a little tired of all the chaos of progressivism. And here's a guy who says, look, let's just get back to normal, whatever normal means. So part of the progressive era was actually focused on reactions against the established order, which many of us think about. There's a movement called the Grange Movement, which you've probably heard of. The Grange Movement really was formed as an organization of farmers to express grievances against the banking system and the railroad industry. Um, Author Sinclair Lewis wrote a very, very famous book called The Jungle, in which he laid out in really very kind of grotesque detail uh, what was going on in packing plants in terms of the lack of worker safety, in terms of disease, and actually this directly led to the inspection of the packing industry, which the United States Department of Agriculture still engages in. I talked about the Women's Christian Temperance Union and their connection not only to prohibition, but also to women's right to vote. We saw the rise of socialism with people like Eugene Debs, who protested the U.S. involvement in the Great War. We saw the rise of African American intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Um, and so, again, the progressive era really is not one thing. Um, and so it's partially focused on ideas like breaking up the industrial and financial control of monopolies. So that was Roosevelt's antitrust movement. Um, it was it was the idea that we should respond to the oppression of poverty in urban centers through social action. This was Jane Addams and the settlement house movement, but other people as well. Um, there was the idea of supporting, or perhaps some people said, taking advantage of immigrant populations. Um, what we know as machine politics or corrupt machine politics actually operated by co-opting the support of immigrant populations and making political promises to these populations. But the progressive era really was about striving also for efficiency in government. And this is the bureau men that Stivers is talking about. And it's really the beginning of the modern executive budget. And that's where I want to take a little diversion in this lecture. Okay, so this is the national budget of the United States. This is from chapter 11 of the Kettle text. This is the national budget of the United States expressed in terms, and you can see on the left axis, expressed in terms of the percent of the gross domestic product. So really, up to about the early 1900s, with some spikes, the budget, the federal budget was not that big in terms of percent of GDP. But look what happens after about 1920. It rises. That very large spike is World War II, which I'll talk about in a second. But then it continued to rise. And so I'll get to why this is. But really, the rise of the increase of the federal budget has a lot to do with the progressive era and the things that we became interested in as a population. So, what is the political role of the budget? A budget is a political process. It's not just numbers, it's a political process. So, what did the founders expect of the national budget? We've been talking about the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, so I wanted to make this connection here. The founders expected a limited taxation power for the national government. What Hamilton and Madison came up with was something they called concurrent jurisdiction, and they talk about this in Federalist number 34. Concurrent jurisdiction over taxation. That means the states and the national government. Hamilton said that the greatest cause of budgetary distress in European nations was fighting wars. And so the United States was really going to avoid that. Under concurrent jurisdiction, local needs were to be met by local taxation. By that I mean the states. Because the national government really only had taxation power over certain tariffs. Spending bills were to originate in the House of Representatives, which seems quaint because spending bills really originate in both houses now. But they were to originate in the House of Representatives. Why? Because it was thought to be the people's house and you were about to spend the people's money. Military appropriations were limited to 2-year appropriations. This is really significant. We've never had a constitutional amendment that overturned this, but this definitively is not really the way we do the military budget now, or any budget for that matter. We do project ahead, even though the budget is a year-to-year process. We project ahead, especially in the military and procurement. We enter into very long-term procurement contracts. We project ahead in our planning for what the budget should be in the out years. But they were serious in the Constitution. They wanted to have control over the military through the power of the purse. Because again, the founders didn't like what they saw in Europe, which was monarchs using their armies to oppress their own people. So if need be, the Congress was going to just simply shut down the military by not budgeting for the military. So government involvement in the economy, which I talked about, really increased post-Civil War. And so part of the progressive era really was on efficiency and taking the sloppiness out of budgeting. So what do I mean by that? Well, this would be in line with what the founders expected. What this chart shows, which I made from information from the Office of Management Budget, and I also I'm showing you a couple different ways to show budget numbers. The previous chart was a percentage of GDP. This is actually a percent of total national outlays year to year. So the amount of money the federal government actually lays out, spends in each of these years is the key here. On the left axis is the percentage of that spent on national defense. So this is really what the founders would have expected. So you see in 1812, there's a big spike. The War of 1812, 80% of the national budget went to the war effort, and then it declined. The Mexican War in the late 1840s, it spiked again. The Civil War, there's a very big spike. So about 90% of the outlay of the Union was dedicated to the war. And then it dropped precipitously in terms of percentage, which we would expect, and the founders would expect as well. It went up a little for the Spanish-American War. It went up more for World War I. It went up dramatically for World War II. World War II and the Civil War were the most costly wars in American history. Um, so at its peak, about 90% of the budget during World War II was spent on the war effort. And then it declined. But what's interesting is that we were still fighting wars. There was a spike for Korea, but in terms of percentage of the national outlay, it wasn't as dramatic. We did fight a war in Vietnam, a very bloody, divisive war, but in terms of the outlay, compared to the rest of the budget, it's only 40%. President Reagan famously did build up the military, and you can see a little hump there in the 1980s. But really, it only took it up to about less than 30% of the national budget, and then it continues to drop. So what's that about? This is really what the founders expected fighting wars would do to a budget. But why did it drop like that? This is really another representation of that. These red circles show these spikes. So around 1820, prior to 1820, that's the War of 1812. Right at 1860, that's the Civil War. Around 1920, that's World War I, and then around 1940, that's World War II. But what you can see here, which is really interesting, is the trend line going up after 1930s goes up, but the war spikes aren't as pronounced as you would think they would be. Why? Because, very simply put, we were spending money on the military, but we were spending a lot of money on other things as well. So this is something I would argue the founders didn't expect, and this really this chart starts about 1940. And this is another way to present budget numbers, and this happens to be per capita outlays. So this is contrasting defense versus domestic spending in year $2,000. So the spike at the left is World War II, and then the Korean War, and then you see the Vietnam War, the Reagan buildup, and post 9/11. So there are spikes, or really the smooth curve kind of bulges up a little bit, really, after World War II. And the blue line, the red line is domestic spending. Well, domestic spending started to increase drastically around the New Deal era, and then really started to go up after World War II, and then really went up a lot after the programs such as Medicare and Medicaid were instituted in the mid-1960s. So the founders would not have expected this much money to be spent on domestic programs. There will never be a time, again, in the future where defense spending will probably overtake domestic spending. That's my prediction. But I'm just saying that I don't think the founders really expected that this would occur. And so part of the progressive era has to do with budgeting. Budgeting was not necessarily pursued as a separate kind of academic pursuit prior to about 1920. Well, why is that? The why is that it was a lot simpler because a lot less money was being spent. But in 1921, Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act, and it really revolutionized federal budgeting because for the first time it established what we call an executive budget. The budgets prior to 1920 were submitted separately by each department to Congress, often without coordination even between departments at the presidential level. In 1921, Congress basically said, look, we want a budget from the president. We want it to outline the budgets for each of the executive departments, and then we want to act on the entire budget. So really, Congress was ceding some of its authority to the president. In 1974, following many of the very large disagreements between the Nixon administration and Congress, Congress passed the Congressional Budget Act to assert more control. So in a sense, the whole history of budgeting is about legislative executive rivalry. But the point I'm driving home here with reference to the progressive era is that executive budgeting was a progressive idea. And that is the idea that budgeting should somehow be rationalized and run by the executive department. That was a progressive idea that really led to and enabled the presidency of FDR in the New Deal. So here's the readings we looked at this week: Stivers, Bureau Men and Settlement Women, and here's a lot of questions about Stivers, and these are some questions I'd like you to consider as you do the reading. I'm not going to read these one by one, but look at these questions, and these I hope will help you guide your reading through Stivers. And I'm going to actually do this for each of the readings. These are some of the things you ought to be thinking about um, in terms of what Stivers is talking about, and in particular, if we're talking about public administration, what do we view as government's responsibility for social action? And what do we view as the nonprofit sector's responsibility in terms of social action? Savara's work, The Structural Reform Impulse in Local Government, talks about one of the other threads of the progressive era, and that is that many progressives saw their mission as making government more businesslike. And so, how do the reforms that Savara is talking about resemble the idea that government should be run like a business? And how does it fit in with this idea of the politics administration dichotomy? This reading by Williams is very interesting because it's talking about measuring government in the early 20th century. Well, one of the things the so-called bureau men were very interested in was coming up with measurements to actually measure performance of government. Well, we're still interested in that, aren't we? So, in a sense, this idea was born in the progressive era. This idea that government can be uh, measured and rationalized. And so, think about these questions as you read what Williams has to say in his article. So that's the end of my lecture. Here's some references, and I'm looking forward to your discussions. Thanks.